Hello there, guys. Here we are, part 4 of the social psych unit. There's going to be 5 parts, so there's this one and one more video. Um, Today, we're going to talk about treating groups differently, other nationalities, other sexes, other religions, other races. Um, Social psychologists have done a lot of work in this field, and there's some interesting stuff here. So, let's get started. We're gonna have some theories, some effects, and some basic stuff. So we need to just go over some terminology, make sure we understand it correctly. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So there's 3 components of prejudice. There's the beliefs you'd have, there's emotions you would maybe have, fear, envy, hostility, and there's a predisposition to act. And when you're acting, based on prejudice, is called discrimination. So a couple other terms. What do we mean exactly by bias? This is a prejudice in favor or against one person or a group, usually in an unfair way. So a teacher who always gives boys first choice would maybe be biased against girls. By the way, if you need to pause the video, I'm going to go through these definitions kind of fast. So if you need to pause it, go ahead. A stereotype is a widely held but oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person. So you would say Japanese people are all this, or Catholics are all that. So that would be a stereotype. With discrimination, it's the behaviors. So a prejudicial behavior towards a different category of people. So you could have prejudice but never act on it. If you act on it, it becomes discrimination. Couple other terms. You might hear the term ethnocentrism. So this is when you evaluate other cultures according to the standards of your own culture. So it's like you've got your blinders on, you're centered, you're just focused on your own culture, and your own culture is the right way to do things. So you might think like Russians are weird because they're not blank like we are. So treating other cultures differently because they're just not like yours. A group that does that, sometimes in the news these days, you'll hear the phrase white nationalism. And this is one of several groups who espouse white supremacy. They advocate for racial segregation, racial superiority. It's kind of a rebranding of the KKK or groups like the Aryan Nation who were around 20, 30, 50 years ago, KKK 100 years ago. So white supremacy, white nationalism is kind of a new name for that. There's another term you'll hear a little bit in the public, but you'll hear it more when you go to college, I think, and the idea is called othering. So it's the idea that you view or treat another person as different from or alien to oneself, that they are the other. So this could be the opposite sex, it could be transgender, could be Jewish people, could be people from the Middle East, whatever. If it's the other, I'm going to treat them different because they're not like me. They are the other. So that's called othering. Okay, when does prejudice develop? It often develops, not always, but often when some people have money, power, and prestige and others do not. So social inequality can increase prejudice. Prejudice works at the conscious level and also the unconscious level. So prejudice is often more like a knee-jerk response than a conscious decision. Obviously, people who join the KKK or white nationalist groups are consciously choosing that. But for a lot of people, it's something called implicit bias. And that's the tendency that a lot of people have, not on purpose, but they have unconscious beliefs about groups of people. So for instance, 30, 40 years ago, 50, 60 years ago, teachers used to call on boys a lot more than they called on girls. And they didn't realize they were doing this, but when independent evaluators would watch them, they would call on boys. Even if girls raised their hand, they would just call on boys more. So starting in the 90s, there was a lot of education of teachers, and this was brought to their attention that they had this implicit bias. And so teachers are now sort of aware of that, and they're taught that, And so you can overcome your implicit bias when you learn about it. There's been some research on implicit bias with race, and they'll do things like flash images of pictures of people, and you'll be associating those pictures with either positive or negative words. And for a lot of white people, when pictures of black people were shown, they did not associate them with words like peace or paradise. So that's not an explicit I dislike black people, but it was kind of an implicit bias where you don't associate black people with positive things. So there's some consequences to the discriminated groups. One of the consequences when people are being discriminated against, if you're black or if you're a woman and you're facing sexism or racism, you get this thing called stereotype threat. That's when people are at risk of conforming to the stereotype about their group. So that's a contributing factor. There's testing differences, like on the SAT or the ACT between boys and girls and between whites and blacks. And they think that stereotype threat is part of that. Like, for instance, there was a long time, there was the idea that girls aren't good at math. And so girls would kind of conform to that stereotype and they wouldn't push themselves or wouldn't take hard math classes. Another consequence is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. A self-fulfilling prophecy is a prediction that causes itself to be true due to the behavior of the believer. So in other words, when an event is brought about because of it being foretold or talked about. So if the prophecy is that black people aren't good at something, then that gets in the head of black people and they end up fulfilling that prophecy. They end up acting in a way that makes it come true. So what about some explanations of discrimination? One is called the in-group bias, another is out-group homogeneity bias, and then there's scapegoat theory and the just world hypothesis. So the in-group bias is when you can think of some of these sexism, racism as there being an in-group of people who share your common identity and an out-group, those people perceived as different. And the in-group bias is the tendency to favor your own group. So this happens with the sexes, it happens with races, religions, nationalities. It could also just happen with like sports teams. Like you see this like Yankees fans of baseball versus the Red Sox fans. They tend to dislike each other even though they haven't even met. But it's the in-group out-group bias. The out-group homogeneity bias is that when you have an out-group, you tend to view, like if I'm in my in-group, I view the out-group as all being similar. So I'm a white guy, I would view maybe black men as all being similar, versus when it's white men, I understand there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of differences amongst us. So it's the idea that they are all alike versus my group is diverse. The scapegoat theory is the idea that prejudice provides an outlet for anger because now you have someone to blame. So this happens like after World War I. The Germans are upset that they're defeated and they blame the Jews. And so the Jews become their scapegoat. They blame them. They take out their anger on the Jews. This also happened in America after 9/11. When the Twin Towers came down, people lashed out against Arab Americans all over the country, even though they had nothing to do with 9/11. Okay, finally, there's the just world phenomenon. A lot of people, without really consciously thinking of it, believe that the world is more or less just. And so people get what they deserve in the world. If you make bad choices, bad things happen to you. If you make good choices, good things happen to you. The world is just. So a lot of times people unconsciously or maybe consciously, they explain away injustice by this idea that everything is just. So they would blame the person in a situation who's a victim. So let's say a homeless person is, he's a Vietnam vet, he's got PTSD, he's suffering from mental illness. can't get a job, can't hold a job, and so he's homeless. Um, so the just world phenomenon, you say, oh, well, he's homeless because he made bad choices. The world is just, versus trying to understand that the complexity of why a person might be homeless and that it might not be entirely their fault and that the world might be unjust. You also see this sometimes with the idea when a woman gets raped, sometimes there's this idea that like she deserved it, which would be the just world phenomenon also. So here's a picture of the just world phenomenon. The small fish thinks there's no justice. The medium-sized fish thinks there is justice, or some justice, and the big fish thinks it's a just world. Okay, how prejudiced are people? The good news is prejudice is the ideas of racism and sexism are going away. They're not as bad as they used to be. If you look at this chart, percentage of people approving in marriage between blacks and whites, it's below 10%. 70 years ago, and this graph ends in 2003. It's up to 75%. So that's a huge change. It's probably even higher today. Here's another graph. Percentage of people answering yes to these two questions. Would you vote for a woman president? In 1936, only 30% of the people. Now it's above 90%. Again, that's in 1995, so this is probably even higher now. And the other question, do whites have a right to keep minorities out of their neighborhoods? It was 55, 60% in 1970, and then it changes dramatically. So something happens in the year 1970. Both these graphs change dramatically. Anyway, it's good news. Gender racial prejudice has gone down significantly. Could still go down some more, but it's been a lot of improvements, a lot of hard work, a lot of people working hard to make those changes. All right, that's it for this topic. See me in class if you have any questions, or email me.